Hello everybody, welcome to my channel here, Wine with Jimmy. Thank you so much for stopping by to the educational channel here, which is designed to help those of you studying or just interested in the wonderful world of wine. Now this video is specifically geared up, do you like what I'm doing here, because it's about transport? It's geared up towards those of you studying your WSET level 4, that is the diploma. If you have any comments or questions or concerns, because this is a free video available on the world of YouTube, you can get in touch by the comment section below. So please make sure you leave your comments, your question or your concern. Please make sure you also click the subscribe button and the like button. Otherwise, there is social media at the bottom of every slide, or you can get in touch direct at info@winewithjimmy.com. So we're going to talk here about the transportation of wine for the level 4 WSET, the diploma. So let's have a look. Now, this is just one video series. I know, isn't that crazy? Normally it's like 7 videos, but just a one video series here on the transportation of wine. Okay, so let's have a look at what we're going through here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, first of all, of transporting wine. Then we'll go into, of course, the major methods of transporting wine today in the world. So historically, now wine's been made for thousands of years. We have, of course, the oldest data going back to the wonderful nation of Georgia and surrounding areas like Armenia and Turkey, for example. And in those days, with those areas expanding, the Phoenicians expanding from today, what we call modern day Lebanon, into most of the Mediterranean, into places like the Greek cities and eventually the Italian peninsula with the Roman Empire, all of these big civilizations would produce wine in some way, shape or form, and they would store them, they would transport them. And typically what was used initially was something called a kvevrij, which is used in places like Georgia, for example. Normally, though, for the production of the wine, not necessarily much transport, but they could be transported in those products as well. And then as you go across to more of the Mediterranean area, these in this picture were used, something which is called amphora, as you all have heard of before. The Greeks sometimes call the larger formats of these pithos, P-I-T-H-O-S. And these were used for transport. How do we know this? Well, we have found lots of archaeology, sunken ships, for example, that were transporting goods that had wine in them. So we found wine pips, grape pips within these containers, for example. So these were used typically. So ships were used to transport wine and other goods, things like olive oil, for example, in amphora quite typically. But also things like animal skins has been used, terracotta, other forms of clay pots, but then eventually barrels. So it was then discovered that the oak barrel specifically would be an excellent vessel for both the production and the storage and the transportation of wine. And that became the very common way of transporting and storing wine. So bottling wine in the winery became important means of quality control in places like France initially, in Bordeaux, for example, but then following on with other fine wine regions in the early parts of the 20th century. Before that, it's all about barrels, okay? So you would go to an inn somewhere along a road in Europe and you would stay there and you get served your wine out of a barrel, not out of a bottle. So by this means, eventually with bottling, the reason why bottling became so important, the producer could guarantee that the final wine was as he or she would intend. And that's rather than being at the mercy of people adding stuff to that wine, you know, because it goes out in a big barrel. People could add things to it, could add water to it to make it go a longer distance, I suppose, in usage, for example. So bottles became, of course, the most important format, and therefore that's what we're going to talk about in terms of the transportation today. So the types of transport then that we find, so road and rail. Of course, across the world today, we have extensive connections via road and rail. Rail, of course, really coming to place in Europe, for example, in the 1850s upwards, and then roads, of course, being really cemented, and sorry for the pun, but really cemented from, of course, all the way back to Roman and Greek times. But of course being further built upon by Europeans and around the world, of course. Now, road and rail today are used to move wine in containers of 24,000 litres, typically from places in southern Europe to northern Europe, where there tends to be a lack of wine in comparison to the abundant Mediterranean. That's what I know quite well, of course, being here in the United Kingdom. There is some wine made here, but not enough for our appetite. So, of course, road and rail are used. But, of course, we need to think about where wines come from outside of the continent. And outside of the continent of Europe, in my example, of course, in the United Kingdom, which is outside the Europe today. This will, of course, come from places like the Americas, South Africa, Australasia. And how do they get here? Well, of course, container ships, like you see in this picture, will, of course, deliver wines from these markets to markets like the Northern Hemisphere, for example. This has given rise to very large scale and very high quality bottling plants at the destination final market, because a lot of the wine actually goes there in bulk. Maybe it's not been bottled yet and it's in containers, which we're going to go through in a very short while. The majority of exported wine, however, is transported in bottle. The transported in bulk, it makes a significant minority at around 40% of volume. But by value, bottled wine is by far the most important. Okay, so glass bottles, of course. Now, today, the main options of transport in glass bottles or in large containers. Premium and super premium wines will continue to be bottled in the winery and transported in cases of individual bottles. As you'll see here, there are some cases that have been shrink wrapped up, but the bottles are within them and they are being delivered from a winery. Actually, this looks like it's going from the winery to a destination market, for example. Large containers. So for inexpensive to mid-priced wines, there's been a rapid increase in the transportation in large containers. And this is what we call bulk transportation. And this also then includes bottling in or near the final market. So, for example, for big producers in, say, California, like the Gallo, Diageo, Blossom Hill, etc., their wine will be shipped in bulk and then bottled in Europe in key destination areas. So it could be for the UK market, there's a bottling plant within the UK. For Central Europe, there's a bottling plant within Sicily, and so on. So this is particularly the case where there is large journeys included, of course, traversing the world. There are two types of container for bulk shipping of wine. There's the more common flexi tank, which is a single-use recyclable polythene bag that fits into a standard container. And then there's the ISO tank, which is a stainless steel vessel built to the ISO standard that can be reused many times and may have additional insulation inside. The flexi tank bag, the first one, is coated with a barrier to prevent taint from external sources. and to reduce, of course, oxidation, so oxygen ingress. Insulated tanks with temperature control, they are known as reefers, and they are available but at an additional cost. And personally, to me, when I first heard that, I was thinking of something else. That's a reefer, R-E-E-F-E-R-S. And if you want to put what you think, and if it's on the same wavelength as me, please put that in the comments section below. Okay, so now we're going to talk about glass bottle transportation in terms of the advantages and the disadvantages. So the advantages of shipping wine in bottle is that the entire product, that's the wine, the bottling, the labeling, and any external packaging, is controlled by the producer. So full control by the producer. So that means the producer, who is very quality conscious, usually has the best control over that product up to that point. The disadvantages is that the smaller amount of wine can be shipped in one container due to the fact, of course, you've got space being taken up by glass bottles. There's also a higher cost in terms of financially and in the environmental cost due to the carbon footprint. So many people that are, in fact, supporting and marketing bag-in-box and things like that are really pushing the environmental side of it more than glass bottles. But there's also problems around potential damage that can happen as well. And this is due to the high, or potentially high and fluctuating temperatures that can happen in transit in the large vessels that we just saw. You can see some of those containers are sitting on top of the ship. Now, often wine will be put down, but that could be close to the engine room where there's more heat, for example. And this could get cold, this could get hot. There could be lots of fluctuating temperature. And there could be potential for spoilage of the labels and packaging in transport as well if it's not actually secured properly. And also shorter shelf life of inexpensive wine because it's bottled earlier than if it were bottled at the destination market. So if you had bulk wine, but then it was bottled and then sent out like this in glass containers, that means, of course, it's going to need to be drunk quicker than something which would have been filled at the destination market, where there may have been, of course, those final pre-analysis checks and any modifications that may need to happen. Bulk transportation. So the advantages of shipping wine in bulk are really mostly the opposites to what we just mentioned. So first of all, it is more environmentally friendly as one container can hold the equivalent of 24 to 26,000 bottles in liquid rather than 9 to 10,000 bottles that have already been filled. So that's around 2.5 times the amount. So much more environmentally friendly in terms of using space. So this, of course, will reduce the carbon footprint. And therefore, for the same reason, it is cheaper. There is also greater thermal inertia of a whole container filled with wine, which means there is going to be less fluctuation of temperatures. It's the same sort of principle as a concrete big container in a winery has that greater thermal inertia as well. So there's less fluctuations in concrete vats in comparison to, say, stainless steel. This will reduce the effects of high temperatures in transport and therefore will reduce the risk of a loss of fruit and oxidation, problems which are attributed to higher temperatures. And this is particularly very important for long, slow, arduous sea journeys across the world, certainly when you go through the tropics, for example. There's also the advantage of strict quality control. So the key parameters of the wine, that's residual sugar, sulfur dioxide, can be measured at the point of filling the container, and again on emptying it, of course, so they can see if there's any measurable differences between those two. The wine can be adjusted, that's things like sulfur dioxide, at the point of bottling right before the final consumer. And the shelf life of the wine can be extended in comparison to bottling with glass bottles that we said earlier. This is calculated from the time of bottling. So, for example, shipping a wine from Australia to Northern Europe takes around 8 weeks. And it's particularly relevant for a bag-in-box with its, of course, relatively shorter shelf life due to the permeability of the bag-in-box. So loads of very promising advantages, but what about disadvantages of the bulk transportation? So your main ones here is the loss, of course, of the direct relationship with the producer. And that means, of course, that's because they are no longer controlling this. It's being controlled by external forces through the transport and then the filling at destination. So the loss of that real sort of personal touch, they can't guarantee fully that they have control over it. But also the transfer of business and employment opportunities from producer countries to the countries which are, of course, the destination market. So, for example, you would normally be employing people for the bottling plant at your producer market. But if, of course, you're getting other people to do this for you because of your big export volumes, this will go to the destination markets in Europe, in Sicily, or whatever it may be, as I mentioned earlier on. And there, in fact, have been big issues around this in areas that produce large volume wines. Certainly when there's large volume at very cheap prices. The big country for that is South Africa. There have been protests in countries like South Africa complaining about the loss of business and jobs due to this process. Shipping in bulk is only commercially viable for larger brands. For example, those that will sell 3 or more containers a year, of course. So we're talking about, up to 100,000 litres and beyond. Okay, so that brings me to the end of transportation of wine. Now, for most of us, this is not the most riveting of topics, but it's interesting, certainly when we bring it into the history, which is really a whole nother course in its own right. But of course, the different aspects here that are taken into consideration. Okay, so that brings me to the end. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can get in touch with me here at Wine with Jimmy. That's by the comments section on this video below. Please make sure you click subscribe and like. But also by the social media and direct at info@winewithjimmy.com. Otherwise, please do come and see me at one of my schools here in London or my wine bar. So come and see us for a class, a glass, or a bottle. I've been Jimmy Smith. Goodbye.